Colonel Prouty wanted me to read some more to you of the secret team. We're in chapter 2, and Hazel is about to jump on the couch. This is going to drive me crazy. She's been driving me nuts all day. The nature of the secret team activity, a Cuban case study. The call was from Miami and was placed to a covert CIA phone drop in Washington. It came from a Cuban underground contact point on the campus of the University of Miami. The control point there had just received a call from an undetermined location in Mexico. The call had been made by the pilot of a Cuban crew that had been lost and had made a forced landing. The crew was safe and the plane was intact, but in Mexico. An old C-54 former U.S. Air Force 4-engine transport had taken off the night before from the secret Cuban training base at Retalhuleu in Guatemala. It was flown by a Cuban crew, and their target had been a drop zone in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Cuba. Everything had gone wrong. The drop zone had been cleared and approved by Washington just a few hours before takeoff, yet it had been hostile. Either intelligence had been bad for the Cuban ground reception party had been captured. The signals from the ground had been right, luring them in with confidence, but as soon as they began the drop, the whole mountainside had erupted with small arms fire. This chapter's so long. They had been ambushed, and they had been lucky to get down safely over the waves and back across the Caribbean. Hours later, somewhere over Central America in a pre-dawn darkness, they had circled over a heavy layer of clouds, watching their gas gauges, waiting for the sunrise and hoping for a break in the clouds so they could let down. Fearful of the mountains and with their radio navigation equipment unreliable, they dared not let down until they had clear contact with the ground. At any point, they cared little for all the precautionary instructions of the agency mission commander that had been giving them during their briefing before they took off. All they wanted to do was to find a safe place to land. They knew the plane was stateless, that it was unmarked and had no insignia. It did not even have a legal call sign. In fact, the big transport was very special, kind of like a sex trafficking airplane. Although it looked like any other C-54 or DC-4, a trained observer would have noted these things, and that it had unusual radios, no engine decals, and no manufacturer's labels. It had unusual radios, no engine decals, and no manufacturer's labels. It was clean, a non-attributable airplane, and it had been sanitized. And it was the pride of the clandestine operations art. It would have been flown anywhere in the world, and if it had been lost on some clandestine mission, the finder, whether he was Cuban, Congolese, or Russian, might have assumed that it had been operated by Americans, but he would not have been able to prove it. In other words, the U.S. government, if required, could have plausibly disclaimed ownership of the plane and that it had had anything to do with the plane, its crew, and its cargo. This plane had been on many flights along the Iron Curtain borders, on left-let drops, and on electronic intelligence missions. It had been used for paradrop missions in Greece and in Jordan. It had been to the Congo and had been delivered black cargoes to the Cantonese, even while the Air Force C-130 aircraft were flying Congolese troops and supplies against the rebels. In special operations, black flights deliver black cargo into denied or unwitting areas. Black in this sense is usually synonymous with clandestine. A black cargo would not go through customs, USA or foreign. A black cargo might be a defector from the communist world being flown to a safe house in the US or other host country. If the black flight crossed the ocean, it would have been known as a deep water flight. Clandestine shipments were made by all the modes of transportation, including submarines and PT boats. It had been to Clark Field near Manila, flying Tibetans to and from operational training sites. It had often been to the old World War II B-29 Superfortress bomber bases in Saipan, where Southeast Asia were being trained in sabotage tactics and paramilitary civic action programs. Epstein. But on this flight, its crew had been Cuban. A former Cuban airline pilot was at the controls, and one of his old pilots was with him. The navigator had at one time trained with the Cuban Air Force, and the radio man, also a Cuban, had been trained at a U.S. Air Force school undercover as a member of a Nicaraguan training mission. The crewmen were all natives of Cuba, and all were working with the CIA at the secret base that had been cut out of the open country of western Guatemala. More than one, likely. In keeping with clandestine operational procedures, the crew had been frisked before they got on the plane and had been given sanitized uniforms for the trip so that they would not have no identification with them in the event they fell into enemy hands. In this case, a somewhat meaningless precaution, but routine somehow. However, in typical old-school pilot fashion, the pilot had written certain radio frequency numbers on his wrist with a ballpoint pen, and some of those numbers were a code for the telephone number of the contact office in Miami. Later that morning, after sunrise, they had flown further to the north, seeking a clearing in the clouds through which May could descend. As soon as they found one, they let down into a broad valley and a small, marked airfield. They landed and skidded across the field into a nearby farm. The first thing they did was to look for a telephone. While they were placing that call, the airport manager and his apprentice came out to see what had happened. After a few moments of eavesdropping, the manager had all the information he needed. The old Mexican drew a gun, and crew was captured somewhere in Mexico. They were not heard from again until after their Cuban friends had attacked the beach at the Bay of Pigs, had been imprisoned by Castro, and ransomed by the United States. It was only after all of these events that the Mexicans released the crew and permitted them to return to Florida. However, their phone call had started some frantic work in Miami and in Washington. The weather map had shown that the heavy cloud cover over Central America gave way to broken clouds further north in Mexico. The CIA called the Pentagon and asked for assistance, and a call was made to the air attaché in Mexico City. He inquired among his Mexican friends about a transport plane, but learned nothing at first. Then several days later, he heard a rumor that a large transport had been made and forced landing at a small southern field. Bang! Sports drink, or whatever drink that is, comes up. He and a CIA man who worked in Mexico City under the cover of a cargo airline made a quick trip to that field. As they approached, they saw a telltale marks of the skidding stop, which had been made by the DC-4 in the fresh turf. The plane was gone. When they landed, the airport manager met them. He told them enough to confirm that the plane they were looking at for had been there, that the Mexican Air Force had flown it away, and that this Mexican and his apprentice knew all there was to know about the incident. Sometime later, the attaché was invited to call upon Mexico Air Force headquarters. He learned that the Mexicans had looked this plane over carefully and did not want to keep it. However, the Mexicans added that they were sure the Americans would be willing to exchange this plane for another just like it. I wonder why. Not long after that, the old black flight DC-4 was returned to its operational base at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. The CIA arranged for the Mexican Air Force to receive a good-as-new DC-4 from the U.S. Air Force, and far to the south, an airport manager, his apprentice, and his son, the husband of the telephone operator who had heard the whole story too. all sported brand new 1961 Ford Thunderbird automobiles from some unknown donor. The true story is not really important except that it raises certain questions that will shake Americans. For example, how does one government agency buy a U.S. Air Force transport aircraft, convert it to a civilian aircraft, and then give it as a tribute to another country in exchange for one which was lost in a clandestine mission? Explosion within myself, neck snap, and some weird ass shit going on outside. And this shit is still going on today. Or how does a government agency purchase 3 new 1961 Ford Thunderbird automobiles and deliver them to a remote site in Mexico and give them to some Mexicans? Who makes such decisions? Why Thunderbirds? Why pay tribute to Mexico for the airplane that quite obviously, once it had been identified, belonged to the U.S.? Its very strangeness made it easier to identify if desired and harder to identify if disclaimed. It would have been stateless only if the United States had disclaimed it. When the United States claimed it, why didn't the government expect the Mexicans to give it back? Who decides such things? And how is all this done in total secrecy? Then, to the next level of questions, who in the government believes that once tribute is paid to another country, such as Mexico, the problem ends there? Does it not occur to these same officials that Mexicans speak to Guatemalans and to Nicaraguans and even to Vietnamese and perhaps to Russians and Chinese as well? Who kids whom? Does the gift of the DC-4 close the case and really buy silence? Or does it more likely escalate the problem? And then what does all of this behind-the-scenes duplicity do to foreign relations? Doesn't it raise some international eyebrows and make some people wonder who is running the foreign affairs of the United States in the first place? Isn't this exactly what Mr. Khrushchev wanted to know when he challenged Eisenhower either to reveal those who had sent the U-2 over Russia without the president's permission, an authorization, or to accept the blame himself, signifying that the United States foreign policy included the authorization of covert operations? If the Mexicans received tribute for one such mistake, would it be surprising to learn that Indonesia's had demanded even more tribute for a bigger mistake? Or when government leadership shifts back and forth, as has happened several times in Laos, doesn't anyone stop to think about the tales that are told by those on both sides of their new friends? What are the Indians telling the Russians about us now in 1972 concerning our actions there in 1962? Or what have the Pakistanis been telling the Chinese concerning their participation in the former U-2 operations or in the Tibetan support activities that have been launched from Pakistan? Doesn't all of this make it seem rather insincere and even hypocritical for some Americans to change other Americans with scrutiny, with security indiscretions, when officials in the government have been telling thousands of foreign people, officials and peons, that the United States has been playing the clandestine game to the hilt? I wonder who traveled to Cairns with the last name Hilton. I wonder, utilizing female looks to advance this operation, how can anyone honestly charge Jack Anderson, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Daniel Ellsberg, or anyone else with serious violations of security when some of these sacrosanct individuals who point the finger have themselves approved of such things as the payment of tribute for our clandestine indiscretions and misdeeds all over the world? All of these questionable operations have begun from small first steps. Just like the $20,000 that Biden sent to was it Nicaragua, Ecuador, for a drag show. In the beginning of the Cuban exercise, the CIA had made contact with de Goron's family in Guatemala for the use of a large tract of farmland for a training site and an airfield. This site was developed to include a full-sized airport from which heavy transports, bombers, and training planes operated on a very heavy schedule. Although this site was remote, it was certainly not secret. The extent of the activity that took place there was such that it did not take long before there was no secrecy and no possibility for denial that something very special was taking place. The whole world knew that a major clandestine operation was underway and that the United States and Guatemala at least were involved. Who paid Guatemala for this? And was it paid to individuals, or was it all paid to the Guatemalan government? Interesting that we sent billions to Ukraine. These questions give clues to some of the characteristics of the CIA and ST operations. Who left billions of dollars and Americans behind in Afghanistan so the Taliban could take over? The Obama administration did. Who is responsible for Iran and the hijab? That would be Americans. They're weekend warriors. They're weekend warriors that protest on the weekends or when they just happen to walk by one and have 1 million followers and then create a video about how they want to wear bikinis on the beach and fuel a mass catastrophe so the Taliban can take over, because that's who her father is. Surprise! The ST members have become so powerful and ambitious that sometimes they no longer respect the basic fundamentals of their profession. As far back as 1948, the CIA had been given limited authority by the National Security Council to carry out only those clandestine operations and the NSC directed. This authority is contained in a series of documents, the first of which was issued in the summer of 1948 and was called NSC 10-4. When the NSC granted this authority, it did so with the firm stipulation that any such special operation must be truly clandestine, that it must be performed in such a manner that if the exercise failed or was otherwise discovered, the U.S. government would be able plausibly to disclaim its role in the operation. And further, that would seem most obvious, but was added for emphasis that it must be truly secret and concealed. Just blame it on the women. And they're guilty. All of them. All celebrity females are guilty. I caught you. These basic parameters as established by the NSC have never been officially retracted, although they have been badly abused by oversight. During the Truman and Eisenhower years, clandestine meant clandestine, and the ability to disclaim the operation plausibly meant that too. But as operations became more frequent and increased in size and scope, as they did against Castro in 1960 and 1961, the CIA became forgetful of these restrictions, of these strictures upon its methods of operations. From time to time, even presidents have permitted a relaxation of their stringent application. The Pentagon Papers reveal how this doctrine had been disregarded, especially with regard to the Oakland 34 and so-called covert raids against Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. In 1961, the CIA had succeeded in building such a broad base within the bureaucracy of the U.S. government that any meaningful reference to the CIA must take into consideration the existence of this vast infrastructure and must not be limited to the legal or table of organization, CIA. Most references to the CIA and to the secret team's book are to that part of the CIA that is not under the Deputy Director of Intelligence. He is responsible primarily for intelligence production and not for covert activity. By 1961, the non-intelligence, the clandestine, and the support sectors of the agency had become so large and so predominant that they far outnumbered the professional band of intelligence specialists assigned to the DDI, both at home and abroad. Like I said, female celebrity, entrepreneur, social media influencers, and the rest. Gotcha. By 1961, it had become apparent that the CIA played a split personality role to suit its own purposes. It would speak of CIA reports which said one thing, and it would be doing exactly the opposite with its undercover covert sections. Surprise again, the government is also working against you. This too becomes readily apparent to the diligent reader of the Pentagon Papers, lest the tremendous significance of such a change taking place within the U.S. government be insufficiently regarded. Consider the words of Arnold Toynbee, the eminent British historian and friend of the United States, as set forth in the New York Times of May 7th, 1970. To most Europeans, I guess, America now looks like the most dangerous country in the world. Since America is unquestionably the most powerful country, the transformation of America's image within the last 30 years is very frightening for Europeans. It is probably still more frightening for the great majority of the human race, who are neither European nor North Americans, but are Latin Americans, Asians, and Africans. They, I imagine, feel even more insecure than we feel. They feel that at any moment, America may intervene at their internal affairs with the same appalling consequences as have followed from American intervention in Southeast Asia. For the world as a whole, the CIA has now become the bogey that communism has been for America. Wherever there is trouble, violence, suffering, tragedy, the rest of us are now quick to suspect the CIA had a hand in it. Same as in this time. Our phobia about the CIA is no doubt as fantastically excessive as Americans' phobia about world communism, but in this case too, there is just enough convincing guidance to make the phobia genuine. In fact, the roles of America and Russia have been reversed in the world's eyes. Today, America has become the world's nightmare. True story. When an uncontrolled and perhaps uncontrollable team can flaunt the historic and traditional codes of civilization by disregarding the honor and sovereignty of our country and other countries, I added our country into that, large and small, by intervening in the internal affairs of other countries for reasons real and contrived, the rest of the world does fear for its own welfare and for the future of this country. When President Eisenhower accepted the responsibility for the U-2 flights over the Soviet Union, no one would have questioned that he did this for correct and honorable reasons. National Aeronautics and Space Administrator Keith Glennon had already made a public statement that the U-2 was operating out of Turkey as a NASA high-altitude flight research aircraft and had strayed over Russian territory inadvertently in high winds. Then Nikita Khrushchev produced the wreckage of the U-2 deep in Russia near Sverdlovsk and made a mockery of the NASA cover story. And when he produced the pilot alive and well, it demolished the rest of the plausible disclaimer. The CIA was caught without a plausible cover story, and the president had to choose. He would either discredit Allen Dulles and the CIA for operating that clandestine flight and a long series of flights without his knowledge, or he could, as Eisenhower did, stand up and take the blame himself on the basis that he knew of and had ordered the flights and was in complete control of everything done in the foreign arena by his government. The latter choice would mean that the President of the United States as Commander-in-Chief during peacetime clandestine operations as he is in time of war. This is a totally new doctrine born of the vicissitudes of the Cold War. Many have considered this a very noble stand on the part of President Eisenhower, and it was. However, this public admission by the chief of state that he had directed clandestine operations within another state is exactly the type of thing that reduces the prestige and credibility of the United States and the family of nations to the condition described by Arnold Toynbee. Interference in the international affairs of one nation by another is an unpardonable violation of international law and custom. The entire Bay of Pigs buildup and operation went much further in flaunting this international code of ethics. At least the U-2 operation on a worldwide scale had been managed in such a manner that the chances for success were great, that the flights were operated in small units with great secrecy, and the stipulation that they be strictly clandestine and plausibly disclaimed in the event of failure was not outwardly flaunted until perhaps the Gary Powers flight. But the Cuban program was otherwise. By the time Cuban operations had been expanded to the point that they had become the beginning of the Bay of Pigs operation, activity of all kinds had been discovered and compromised by the press of the world. There were no more secrets. The participation and support of the U.S. was known to be taking place in Puerto Rico, Panama, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, in addition to some unscheduled action in Mexico. Yet the ST continued to launch an increasing number of special operations without regard for real secrecy. There was not only a breakdown in the traditional ethics of international relations, but there was also a serious degradation of the usual high standard of technical operational methods within the government. The flights from Guatemala themselves were not tactically sound, nor were they politically effective. Most of these flights not only failed miserably to accomplish what the CIA thought they would do, but in place underground cadres of guerrillas and provide equipment and communications material for other underground groups in Cuba. But as a result of their amateurism and failures, they played into the hands of Castro. They never did become a rallying point for anti-Castroites. On the contrary, they exposed and compromised them and led to many unnecessary firing squad deaths. The flight paths by their crossing and recrossing pinpointed and exposed ground reception parties, which were mopped up by Castro's troops. In other cases, aircraft were lured over drop sites that proved to be ambushes. The whole series of operations exposed the weaknesses of CIA's tactical capacity. The CIA cannot properly direct large operations and it has led many small ones successfully, but this failed miserably in a number of large ones. An important oversight inherent in such activity was mentioned by David Wise and Thomas B. Rose in their book, The Invisible Government. They reported that the chiefs, U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, were told that the invasion was not a Pentagon operation and that they could give advice only when called upon. Because of the secrecy involved, they were not allowed to take their staffs into their confidence. This, of course, cut down on the overall effectiveness. This was only a part of the story. The chiefs were told to keep hands off, yet the agency was operating down through all services to the tactical level, taking supplies, arranging training, utilizing all forms of transportation. However, few, if any, military personnel even knew enough of what was really going on to give proper advice, and they had been asked. This is one of the greatest weaknesses of the ST's classified method of operation. Because of the ST acts in response to intelligence data inputs, it does not operate in compliance with or in support of a plan or policy. It creates an umbrella or catch-all policy such as anti-communism, then declares that all of these operations are anti-communist, and attempts to justify that it does solely on the basis to clarify by example. A Cuban reported to another Cuban who was in touch with a CIA contact man in Miami that B had friends back in Cuba who were willing to blow up a major sugar refinery, but they had no munitions or other equipment necessary to do this. The CIA Cuban reported to his contact. A meeting was arranged right away in a safe house. For example, in the Latin American Geological Survey offices somewhere on the campus of the University of Miami, the first Cuban showed on a map where his friends were and explained what they planned to do. The CIA contact man proposed that the first thing to do would be to establish contact with them and then to place a clandestine radio with them to test the zeal and veracity of the informant. It was suggested that this be done by putting him ashore at night near the target. He agreed on the assurance that he would be picked up the next night. He was taught how to use the clandestine radio and was provided with a special kit of munitions. He was put over the beach and directed to bring one Cuban out with him for further training. All went well to that point. At no time in this almost automatic response process did anyone in the CIA ask, "Why are we doing this?" The simple Pavlovian animal instinct to go ahead and do it because it was an anti-Castro move was all the agents needed at this stage of activity. But this is where it always starts, of course. The ST members would have right on their side in their almost religious missionary zeal to do good. The first agent would not only have heard that the Cubans planned to blow up the sugar refinery, but they would have flavored this with ideas of the injustice there and with the accounts of the brutality of Castro's police. And they would have pledged the reason they wanted to kill Castro was that they want to bring democracy to their homeland and to all Cuban people. The fun and games must always be founded upon sanctimonious grounds. At the same time, lip service is paid to do-gooder causes. There is scarcely ever any practical consideration of whether or not such an action or those that will follow, whether the initial action succeeds or fails, are really in the best interests of the United States. The exfiltrated Cuban was given rudimentary demolition training at a remote site in Florida and was taught to use signal lights and panels as well as the radio. Less than a week later, he was back in Cuba at work with his neighbors in the sugar refinery gang. Although everything seemed to have gone well, these inexperienced, though patriotic Cubans had no understanding of how Castro operated. Notice Obama. Communist perfected bloc system that was in effect in Cuba and that blanketed the entire island. No one in the CIA had warned them about this if the thought had ever crossed their minds. As soon as the first Cuban had been exfiltrated, his absence was duly noted by the system. He had not appeared for work for the refinery, but not a word was said there. A teacher at school was tipped off to make a discreet inquiry of the man's child. "Could your father come to school to see your pretty drawings?" "Well, no, teacher. You see, my father is not feeling well. He's sick." Then a state medical technician stopped by his home and asked to see the father because he has been reported he is sick. The mother explained that he was not really sick. It was his uncle in Santiago who was sick, and he had gone to see the uncle. So that the net was drawn tighter. Even before he had been returned to Cuba, a Castro agent had been infiltrated into the refinery work crew. And by the time the Patriot returned, Castro's men were ready. They waited, alert. They listened to all the plans. Perhaps they joined in encouraging the plans. Then on the night of the raid at the refinery, everything went wrong. The whole cabal had been rounded up, and in no more time than it took for the radio operator to flash an emergency signal in Miami, it was all over. The reaction to the first information input by the first CIA agent had doomed those men to death and their families and friends to lives of misery. Castro's control, rather than being weakened, had been strengthened by the brutal elimination of a few more men of blind courage and the example of that same fate for others who might wish to conspire with the Yankees. In this example, which is a true case, if the attack had been successful, what good would it have done? Do such random bits of vandalism and sabotage actually further the foreign policy goals of the United States? Is the kind of anti-Castroism really pro-American? The very little harm to Castro and his government, if any, that might possibly have been done, could not conceivably generate enough benefit to the United States ever to compensate for the loss this country suffers when such activities fail, as they so often do. This brings to mind the prophetic words from the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I wonder often where the vintners buy one half so precious as the stuff they sell. I wonder often what the vintners buy one half so precious as the stuff they sell. So basically they say they do it for fun. I wonder often what do you buy? What you buy is worth half of what you sell. Meaning the death of these I wouldn't say innocent, the death of these people and the concerns that is placed upon the family with the death of these people that they love, because they think they're doing right by the countries, saving their own country, is way more important than what they're receiving when they do the acts and the acts fail, or even both.